Good afternoon. I'm Chandra De Silva, Interim Provost, and it's my pleasure to welcome you for this year's second conversation on teaching. Last month, we had a presentation by the Department of Psychology, because this year, instead of having individuals talk about teaching, we have panels from the same discipline talk about teaching within their own discipline. And today, I'm happy to introduce the Department of History. And as I came in, Austin Jersild reminded me, as if I needed any reminding, that I was a member of the History Department, or that I am a member of the History Department. I'm proud to be with you. But let me, first of all, introduce the panel, and then hand over moderating the discussion to Austin Jersild, who is the chair of the department and a historian of Russia and many other areas. First, we have Robert Holden, historian of Latin America, who actually is interested in the discipline of history. And I'm told that today he will talk a little bit about the boundaries of history and the ways in which these boundaries between history and other disciplines are somewhat porous. And then there's my friend. They're all my friends, but this is a particular friend.
Thanks.
Ingo Heidbrink, who works on maritime history and the history of the Antarctic region. And he has really been interested ever since he came here, and maybe before that, on the ways in which we can make history something usable for students, how we can learn from history. And then, last but not least, is Megan Natzman, who is an expert on the history and archaeology of the Mediterranean. And I think she will talk to you about ways in which she conveys historical knowledge to her students. And I'm not going to steal her thunder from her, so I'm not going to say how she's going to do it, but await her presentation with great anticipation. So at this stage, what I'm going to do is to hand over the mic to Austin Jersild, who is the Czar of History.
There is nothing more to be said after Chandra's introduction. Thank you so much, and it brings back fond memories of when you were in the history department on a daily basis. And we've heard rumors about your retirement, but we know probably you're coming back to the Department of History, and and you are most welcome there. I'm going to pass this along. I will keep my eye, as the czar, as you say, on the clock, and I will join the audience. Bob, you want to start?
Okay, very good. Thank you, Austin. Well, Provost De Silva framed this invitation to participate in the discussion as two things. First, as a dialogue within a disciplinary culture and knowledge tradition, but also as a dialogue into which we would simultaneously welcome colleagues outside of our discipline. So we have two distinct audiences here. My comments are kind of directed to both at once. May sound a little schizophrenic, but I'll do my best to respond to both of these objectives. To get us started, Chandra proposed 8 questions. Don't worry. I'm only going to pick the first one. I only have 10 minutes. And I chose the first question at the top of the list. It struck me as the most fruitful and the most interesting. How does the culture and knowledge tradition of your discipline frame your teaching practices, which I guess is really what the essence of why we're here. And before I get into this in any detail, I just want to kind of sum up, I guess, the basic premise of what I'm going to say in 3 words, and that is own your discipline. Don't start teaching it by pointing out the exit doors. Know its boundaries and its reason for being. Make that knowledge a core part of your teaching. I think this is what we owe to our students, whether they're majors or not. Disciplines are good. They exist for a reason. There's a lot of counter arguments about this, so I'm taking a position here. And if I had time, I'd develop this a lot more. Disciplines have a history they can tell us a lot about, but I won't go there right now. Of course, we can and we should cross those boundaries when we find the convenience to do so in the classroom as well as in our research. And in this respect, history is, by nature, I think, probably the most promiscuous of all disciplines. And I confess to having frequent, intimate, unprotected, but consensual intellectual contact with political scientists and sociologists and anthropologists, and most gratifyingly of all, philosophers. But what I try to do is import that knowledge and those insights into the country of history writing and history research and history teaching, and try to make them my own. So what follows will be guided by the principle that I think the main principle is that we owe it to our students to link our teaching practices to the discipline's reason for being. I think we have to go out of our way to think through that when we make assignments, to demonstrate why we exist as a discipline, why we're taking a history course and not some other course. And I think also in connection with that, anybody who's a non-historian who's interested in sort of importing something from history into their own discipline or their own work or teaching would benefit from what I have to say as well. So that's sort of a second principle, trying to deliver something to both these audiences. So first I want to indicate briefly what it is I think my discipline is for, what it does, and then get to the heart of this, which is share a couple of classroom practices which are intended to teach that discipline, right? In terms of what it is, show what it is. First, what is history? I think this is an important question because I think probably most of my students are actually indifferent to this question. Some of them say they love history because they love the past, the way antique collectors love to sort of like old things. And so for a lot of them, history is a branch of literature. And this is not an entirely useless idea because it might, if nothing else, be a good motivator, but it's extremely incomplete and rather misleading. Some think of historians as chroniclers, sort of minute takers, record keepers. And here the mistake is to overlook the tremendous range of ways in which historians actually interpret the record and see it from different standpoints. No, it's not as if there's sort of one record that can be just sort of extracted and held up. For others, history is a teacher, or rather a kind of oracle that delivers unambiguous lessons for the future. So the idea here is that every event, if you stare at it long enough, will offer some obvious pointers about what to do or what not to do. The trouble with this, of course, is that historians, again, look at events from a great variety of angles. They come to their events with very different presuppositions. They don't even agree on what constitutes a historical problem. They can disagree about that, worth investigating, I should say, let alone on the range of possible solutions to that problem. Another risk of this way of thinking about history is the history as teacher idea is it can very, very easily be, the past itself, I should say, can be easily hijacked by ideologues who are eager to use the past as sort of an indoctrination device. And I think students are particularly vulnerable to this way of thinking about history. Somewhere along the line they picked this up, and it's not exactly unknown in my profession. So anyway, my first teaching move in response to all these sort of misconceptions is, first of all, to try to separate two meanings of history. The first as the past, which is huge, and in its hugeness, ineffable and unfathomable. And second, the history as an academic discipline, the purpose of which is to study and refine and develop the record of the human past. And to do that by adopting a conventional discipline in the sense of discipline now is sort of is where this idea came from, certain methods and procedures that are likely to ensure a successful outcome in that endeavor. meaning reasonably truthful interpretation of whatever it is that you're comparing or investigating. So in a nutshell, the word I like best is understand. Historians aim at understanding the past and to understand something. And here I owe something to Alistair McIntyre. To understand something means to have arrived at the truth about it. That's our aim, right? Including most of all, just how and why something came to be. So explanation is central to understanding. And if you take that a little bit farther, what's the purpose of understanding? The purpose of understanding, I propose, and this is not McIntyre, I won't blame this on McIntyre. The purpose of understanding is to verify the truth about the memories we carry around about ourselves and the wider world we live in. And those memories are important because they very critically shape how we identify ourselves and how we make sense of the world we share with others. So memories matter. Getting them right matters. They matter because they tell us who we are as individuals, and even maybe more important at times as communities of individuals. So if we get them wrong, we're likely to fall short, maybe very short, in achieving our goals, or even in defining our goals. Now, it turns out that before 2010, I could teach that a little easier. It was a little easier to teach my students that it was worth seeking the truth about the past, because until then, the Old Dominion University officially defined its mission. You can find this in the catalog then. This way, Old Dominion University promotes the advancement of knowledge and the pursuit of truth. Very useful, right? In teaching students about what we're, and sort of fitting into that definition. And then in 2010, the Board of Visitors redefined the mission, entirely eliminating any reference to truth-seeking, and amazingly even to the advance of knowledge. So I can't use that source as I used to. Now we hear in the ODU's mission has something to do with rigorous academic programs, strategic partnerships, and active civic engagement. Kind of unfortunate direction in terms of the mission, but I'm still trying to carry it out in the classroom. So anyway, a simplified summary of what history is for would be two things. First, acknowledge that the past is very much with us in the present in the form of memories that shape our ideas about who we are and what we ought to do. And then secondly, acknowledge that those memories will always be incomplete and inaccurate to some degree, and therefore are always in need of refinement and correction, and that's where we come in. So we can say historians are called on to aid in understanding the past. And this is where I get close to my teaching methods. How do we do that? Well, first, we identify historiographical problems. Secondly, we justify the study of those problems. And third, we propose solutions or interpretations according to certain methodologies. And so how do I convey that purpose to students in a way that will be able to apply it professionally? It turns out very few students in history will actually turn out to be historians. They're going to be doing other things. Almost all of them are going to acquire some kind of professional employment, and as a result, they will inevitably be called on to write reports to their supervisors. Reports that coincidentally require them to investigate some problem, gather and evaluate evidence, analyze a number of possible solutions, and propose an evidence-based solution that is logical, coherent, and persuasive. Engineers do this, elementary school teachers write reports, social workers write reports, and so on. So I've taken to not assigning essays or papers, but reports. I call them historiographical reports that have a very specific aim. Students are required to read up on a topic that interests them. Now they have the complete freedom, the creativity to find something that interests them. Then within that topic, identify a particular problem related to that theme that arises in the historiographical record. It could be a problem of causation, understanding a particular process, weighing the outcomes of some event or series of events. They do enough library research to find, say, 3 or 4 different solutions or interpretations that historians have proposed in response to that problem. They compare the responses, evaluate their quality, their persuasiveness on the basis of evidence, documentation, logic, and then, based on their own analysis, propose their own. And by the way, this assignment follows the exact procedure, coincidentally, of the Reasoning Through Writing and Research program that President Broderick announced in 2011 in preparation for an accreditation visit. I'm not sure that program still is around. I think it may live on in what's called the Improving Disciplinary Writing Workshop, now being offered to faculty here. But I think it's a pretty good way to teach report writing, and it coincides very well with what we do in history. So there are certain practical advantages to this assignment that I want to highlight here, and this is where it gets more specifically to the, I guess, the exact theme here of this panel. And I think I have maybe a couple of minutes left. And I think that can also be imported in different ways to other disciplines. What are the practical advantages of a historiographical report the way I've outlined it? First of all, and most importantly, it teaches in a simplified way just what history is for. It's not telling stories. I don't invite my students to tell stories, to provide a platform for their personal opinions or look for simple-minded lessons from the past, right? What they're aiming at is solving problems that arise within the discipline of history in the written record of the past. And they're going to encounter, as they do that, a whole variety of interpretations or solutions that will call on them to exercise their own critical acumen in evaluating fairly and honestly what they're reading. So that's called critical reading, right, among other things. The second advantage is that the assignment duplicates, by the way, exactly the very first step, the very first move of a professional historian who always starts to investigate, starts a project or an investigation by reviewing the historiography. So what I'm asking them to do is what I would do when I actually open a project. Thirdly, the assignment, that is to identify a problem and justify it and compare the solutions, evaluate them, and so on. It provides an instant organizational structure for the report. So it's not that hard to organize, pretty simply. And I even show them how they can do it. And so they get in the habit of presenting it in an organized way. The fourth advantage is it's very hard to plagiarize these assignments because of the way they're designed. Unlike the assignment, just write a report, write a paper or something, which is pretty easy to do. You could buy just about anything on the market now. But this is organized in such a way that it's very difficult to find somebody else to do it or to plagiarize it. The fifth advantage is that it rewards students who actually take the time to read pretty widely in a particular topic before they identify a problem. I insist that they do a lot of reading. The more reading, the better. So the best papers are usually those that show they've done a lot of preliminary reading. It's very hard to dream up something like this on your own. And so finally, I also require a prospectus, right? Before the report, they actually write a preliminary prospectus, which gives them an opportunity to demonstrate what they're planning to do, and then we can talk about that. We also have oral kind of presentations as well, initially just between me and the student. The student comes to me, tells me about their project, then they write a prospectus, then they write the paper. So there's a lot of sort of supervision along the way. I've outlined this whole thing in this document here, which is available online at that site. That's where I've kind of documented just about everything I've said here. So that's all I have.
Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome.
Yeah, basically, as already mentioned, I'm a maritime historian and therefore, up to a certain degree, kind of by nature of my own historic subdiscipline, inclined to cooperate with the natural sciences. And if we are thinking about the marine area, this kind of normally used interdisciplinary work in history seems to be prone to disciplines like maritime history or some other fields more than to other fields within the discipline. And so I decided to focus a little bit on this field, in particular on the question of interdisciplinarity, or you might also say how to make history useful, how to make it applicable. And I thought the easiest would be to begin with a source, and very typical source for historians. But if you are thinking about this in the context of science class, of an oceanography class, and very few students would have the ability to analyze, to get a critical approach to such source material, to take from the source material a little more than it's just an outdated ship and maybe an interesting expedition of the 1860s. But if you're really thinking about it, as Bob has mentioned, there are different ways to look at it and there are different ways to take materials from it. But brings me at the same time to the question, is interdisciplinary teaching that easy that we can simply combine history students and students from the sciences into one room and try to develop a common core or common curriculum for those two groups that works for both of them? Unfortunately, I need to admit, in my experience with teaching on both sides of this, you might say, major divide of the academic world, it's not so easy. And it's not because students aren't really prepared, it's basically because we are seeing very different approaches. You might simplify it to the expectation, what are you expecting when you are repeating an experiment? In the natural sciences you are expecting the same result again and again, unless or otherwise your experiment isn't really valid. Do the same thing in the humanities. Of course, you're looking forward to get different results again and again because of different interpretation. So we have this, you might say, clash of cultures when we are teaching at this divide. And when I taught classes with such a group setting, the main result was frustration on one side or on the other side with the students. And because students simply told me after the class that 50% of the class was boring to them because it was repetitive and so on, and so it didn't really work out. And when thinking about this and thinking about how to continue with an interdisciplinary approach where history might become applied history or a usable past for many other disciplines, we might need to rethink the whole setup. And I think looking at historical data and looking at the concept of making historical expedition data useful for today's analytical research in the sciences might be an interesting field to do so. And if you are thinking about these two worlds colliding, means a research vessel from the 1860s and a research vessel from the 2000s. And so basically what you are seeing is two worlds that cannot really communicate with each other. And what is the solution? Of course, we can use historical analysis to deal with research reports and with data from the 1860s, maybe even to analyze the data in a way that modern scientists can deal with the data. And we can also try to prepare scientists for becoming able to deal with this historical data. And up to a minor degree, we might also be able to prepare history students or students in the humanities to understand the scientific concepts of today. But can we do it in one classroom? And what I think in this experience, no, we can't really, because if you're really thinking about it, you have a very strange situation. You have normally pretty advanced students, even graduate students or PhD students in this, but when it comes, or you might also say intellectually mature students, but when it comes to history and to historical research and applying historical methods, you have absolute beginners, or you might say you are on the history 100 or 200 level. And therefore you need to modify your whole teaching concept, in my experience, and you need to think about very fast-paced classes, or you might say classes with an extreme steep learning curve, because you have these intellectually mature students that are beginning looking into another discipline, and therefore I think might be an idea to consider transdisciplinarity. That means not just mixing, but preparing to cooperate with another field. And might be an interesting concept to do this if we are looking on how to make history usable for the sciences, to think about fast-paced summer classes. Of course, the Maymester might be an idea, and because there you have really this possibility to do this in this fast-paced way. At the same time, you are not really interrupted by history students with traditional historical problems and with the ability to deal with these traditional historical problems. And so basically what I'm stating with this, my experience when it comes to this situation, modern science, historical analysis of scientific methods of the 19th century. Don't do it in one classroom. Don't try to mix. Don't think about interdisciplinary, but think about introducing historical methodology to the science student, and think about doing it in a way that respects that they are well-advanced students, intellectually mature people. And when I'm thinking about possibilities at this institution, as far as I know, and I might be wrong with it, I hope that I might be wrong with it, but the setup with classes designated to a certain discipline or being cross-listed to a variety of discipline. If you're thinking about such a concept, you're running up to a certain degree into a problem, because even if I offer such a class and it's cross-listed for the natural sciences, of course it continues to be a history class, and having history students within such a class is at the same time causing problems for the class. So I think there's room for further improvement of certain structures, and to think about development of not only interdisciplinary approaches, but how to integrate real transdisciplinary approaches into the school. Thanks.
So I want to start by thanking Austin and Provost De Silva for having me here. It's a tough act to follow my senior colleagues here. I've got a lot less experience than they do. But I want to talk about something that I've done so far that I've found to be exciting and fun, and I think the students are enjoying it also. So I want to start by saying I work in ancient history. And I feel like this is a great time to be working on ancient history. Students are very excited about it, very interested in it on the one hand, but on the other hand, in many ways, I get non-majors who aren't prepared. They're coming in with background from popular culture and things like that that have piqued their interest, and so I have excited students. But on the other hand, dealing with evidence, dealing with sources, is a struggle for them. And I approach that in the classroom by bringing in a lot of different types of evidence. I bring in archaeological evidence, I look at architecture, I look at mosaics and frescoes like at Pompeii, I look at papyri, which gives us a glimpse into the daily lives of people. I look at inscriptions, especially funeral inscriptions, that show us what people valued at the moment of their death. But when you get to political history, and a lot of people coming into a class on ancient Greece and on ancient Rome, they're interested in this political history, but then they start to their eyes glaze over a little bit, because then it starts to turn into names and dates and foreign terms that they have to remember, and it gets a little bit more complicated, and some of these other types of evidence that I bring in aren't as applicable when I'm talking about political history. And one of the things that I've done so far is I've introduced some role-playing into my classes, and this specifically deals with political history in a way that helps them understand the complicated political climates, especially of Greece and Rome. These aren't scenarios that I've written myself. This is a pedagogy series, the Reacting to the Past series, and I've used two of them. The threshold of democracy is set in Athens, right after Athens gets defeated in the Peloponnesian War, and Athens is trying to rebuild itself and figure out how to pick up the pieces and move on. And Beware the Ides of March is set right after the assassination of Julius Caesar, and what do we do in the city now? And so I'd like to talk a little bit about both of these. So one of the things, this is a shot of Athens, and this is actually where the assembly met in the city of Athens. This is called the Pnyx. It's where all of the citizens would come together and anybody could speak who wanted to. This is the speaker's platform right here. And so I start with images like this. And what the goal of these games is to get students to recreate the debates that took place in the assembly. And so there's a series of topics, and much like a traditional, exactly like a traditional history paper, the focus is on argumentation. It's on reading evidence and making an argument about it. The only difference is that they're doing it in the first person instead of doing it in the third person. So they're all given characters. Sometimes these are fictional characters with background information, and sometimes they're real characters with background information. And they're divided into factions, the different factions that had a lot of political sway in the city at that time. And so here you see the four factions that were important in the city of Athens in 403 BCE. So the radical Democrats are the ones who really want who pay people to get involved in political government, pay people for coming to the assembly, pay people for coming and sitting on the jury courts. The moderate Democrats are really focused on rebuilding the Athenian Empire that got defeated in the Peloponnesian War. The oligarchs want to restrict the citizen body and restrict it based on a property qualification and bring it closer to what's happening at the beginning of the 5th century until the end. And the Socratics are the followers of Socrates. So for example, with the Socratics, I could easily assign a paper that asks my students to look at the Republic, which is Plato's representation of Socrates' views, and ask them to make an argument about what Socrates is proposing for the government of the city, and to consider how other citizens of Athens would have reacted to Socrates' proposals for government. But instead, the Socratics have to make that proposal in the first person, and they have to deal with what can be a rather rowdy assembly, heckling them to a slight degree, asking questions, making them defend what they're saying. So they give these short presentations, and then they turn in basically written speeches where they've got all of their documentation, they're citing their sources, just as we would in a regular history paper. But acting this all out gives them a sense for how complicated the political dynamic really was at this point in time. It also allows students who want to be a little bit creative to get a little bit creative, and you see that in the classroom, and you also see that in some of their writing. The chance to be just a little bit creative, to frame their argument, is something that they enjoy, at least something that some of them enjoy, and it gets them more interested in diving into those sources and using those sources as a way to make an argument. I have also done the Ides of March. So right after the assassination of Julius Caesar, this is a model of the building actually where he was assassinated, right in here. And again, the same thing applies as applied in the situation of Athens. We've got two major factions here. The people who supported Julius Caesar, a lot of these were appointed to the Senate by Julius Caesar because he increased the number of people in the Senate from 600 people to 900 people. So a lot of them owe their position directly to him. And then the Republicans who want to return to Rome the way that it was really before the late Republic and all of the civil wars. And so the first question that the students have to deal with in the Ides of March is, was Julius Caesar a tyrant, and the people who killed him tyrant slayers and freedom's the wrong word, tyrant slayers and heroes who deserve to have statues set up of them across the city of Athens? Should his body be thrown in the Tiber as a criminal? Or should he be given a state funeral? And likewise, what to do about all of the people that he appointed. I think this is an aspect of Roman history that's often overlooked. He had made lots of appointments into future years. Julius Caesar had appointed people to all of these various positions for years to come. And now these people wanted to be able to take up those offices. And how do we handle that? So the students, again, are able to act out some of this. And one thing that's really nice about the Beware the Ides of March, the Senate debate, is students begin to realize how complex the political hierarchy was. People process into the Senate basically in an order of precedence, so they understand how hierarchical some of these offices are in a way that I don't think any of them would. I could put up charts on PowerPoint and outline it all for them, but somehow seeing these people march into the classroom, class after class, brings this point home more for the students. So I use these tools not throughout the semester. I cluster them, or I do one towards the end of the semester after we've been dealing with traditional evidence all along in the semester, and it's that evidence we've been dealing with previously that they're using to draw on to write these argumentative speeches and argumentative presentations for the class. And so far, I feel like the little bit of difference, the little bit of creativity, especially in a class where they might not expect it coming into it, is something that I feel that they respond positively to. And it still preserves the discipline of history, the argumentation, the analysis of evidence, and the asking of questions and the answering of questions, but it does it in a slightly different way.
Yes, you're allowed to ask questions, Jane. Thank you, Megan. Jane, before we start, can I just thank Allison? You got us going on this discussion, and this has been very productive, and thank you so much for getting through this whole thing.
No, I think Megan kind of brought this home, but I think even, Bob, when you introduced some of the issues and problems you have with teaching history and framing what history is to students, it is about the past. And you try to make it very real for them by having them enact these arguments. But I'm wondering if you also run into problems which I run into, which is students kind of mix up things. They see this radical Democrat or radical democracy and Republican, and they just assume that these terms mean what they think they mean in the present. I mean, do you try to unravel some of that to get them to complicate the presentism in the past?
I think the best example of this, and absolutely I run into it, in Athens, one of the first things they have to decide on is what they're going to do with the people that supported this oligarchic regime that was briefly in control of Athens at the end of the war, the 30 tyrants. And in reality what happens is Athens passes a reconciliation agreement, and you can't bring any charges against any of these people accused of collaborating with the tyrants. This becomes an issue because Socrates was imagined to have been a supporter of the tyrants. And when they want to bring him to trial, what we get is people wanting to make a free speech argument. I want to be able to talk about Socrates' support for the tyrants, and if the reconciliation agreement passes, they're not allowed to do that. And yet I get students that want to introduce a free speech argument. And this is very anachronistic in ancient Athens. And so absolutely, we deal with that head on. And that's the one that's always going to come up in this.
To think the past is the past, and people thought about the world differently.
Right.
And teaching early American history, it must be easier when you're in such a world, ancient Rome or ancient Greece, where people are so removed from it by time. But early American history, everyone thinks, well, I know this, so they don't want to get you to complicate and change the definitions of those terms,
Maybe let me chime in. Even in this model I introduced, using historical expedition data, that is basically also the main challenge, that students understand, regardless if history students or science students, that you can't simply take the past and put it into today's framework, but that you need to translate it. Easy example, they are dealing with position data of a certain research station, and they are simply using the historical data for modern modeling system. Now think about navigation in the 1860s, and you really need to unravel this, and I think that is maybe the common element here, that we need to communicate to students, and that you cannot simply project the past into today.
Yeah, I'd like to, you mentioned concepts, defining concepts. That's really, I discovered pretty quickly teaching here that you can't just throw out words like liberalism, democracy, or even slavery and expect people to know exactly what you mean by them. Liberalism is a good example. When I teach the 19th century, I can't talk about liberals and say, well, we don't define them. The 19th century liberalism is not what liberalism today is in American political culture. So I think it's really important when we get to concepts, abstractions. For example, slavery. I mean, most of my students will think slave is somebody who works hard. I mean, it's a piece of property. You have to take the time to define these concepts and then show how they may have been understood differently at different times. No.
Any other questions? Yes. Really? Okay, coming at you.
Yes, I was wondering, to what extent do you think analogies inform the present? Analogies to historical events, and what are the dangers in using analogies? Do we have guidelines for how to use them? What do you think?
Well, I guess my first reaction to that is history does not repeat itself. So analogies are inherently risky. I would avoid them. I think it's important to understand how a particular event occurred, what were the conditions that made it possible, and then to compare that in those terms to something else, something more recent or something in another region, but not assume that they're analogical. That's pretty risky. That doesn't mean to say that it's out of the question, but I think it has to be approached pretty carefully.
Questions?
I think you're posing a difficult problem there, though, because it's almost impossible to talk about any problem in the present without making some reference to the past. What else does our language mean and signify other than that it's emerged over time through some particular historical context? But it's a fascinating point that you bring up. I'm sorry, that's not really a question.
Well, yeah, I mean the past is present in the present, right? I mean it's here. But the question of whether you can draw an analogy between different and learn something because it's a sort of a repetition. I think the danger is in this idea that it's a repetition.
Yeah,
I mean that's the problem.
Yeah, I use an analogy that helps to counter that, because we talked about Salem witchcraft accusations this week. And many people kind of thought about the Crucible, that was really based on the 1950s McCarthy era. And so, I wanted to point out to my students how different, even though those are used as analogies, right, they're really different in the context that they came from. Puritanism and these beliefs in witchcraft and beliefs in God's and Satan's real presence in the 17th
very
century,
different.
very different than what was going on in the 1950s. So you can use it an analogy to kind of help students understand the difference between a past event and the thing that people are trying to make analogous.
Maybe a helpful point here would be to distinguish between changes and continuities. In each case, there are certain changes and certain continuities. I mean, we're always dealing with these. We're trying to reconcile change and continuity. And I think if you have two events that appear alike, you can talk about how they're different and how they're alike, and then say, well, what can you draw from that? To what extent are they really analogical? Can you learn anything from them? But if you focus on change and continuity in each case, I think you can make the distinction you need to make.
The history that we know right now, we study, has been written by people that in power during the event or just after the event. So we know that point of view. We seldom know the point of view of what happened with the people that were not in power. How do you compatibilize?
You're talking about the people without history, as Eric Wolf called
example,
them. People who don't leave a record of their participation. Is that what you're talking about?
No, example, the conquest of America by the Spaniards. The history that we know is the Spaniards' point of view. We don't know the Incas or the...
Okay, right.
Basically, I'm thinking about this in the maritime history context. Of course, history itself, in the traditional understanding of the discipline, might come to substantial issues with this. But as Megan has clearly illustrated, if we branch out into other sources, into other source materials, into additional evidence, we might be able to unearth at least a little. Problem is, if we are thinking about history as a discipline, there are other disciplines also dealing with the past, using different approaches, using different methodologies, and I think us here, we are basically representing the traditional historical method that comes pretty soon to an end when there is no, let's say, traditional historical evidence available. Opens again the field for cooperation with neighboring disciplines.
This is actually more a practical question to Megan on reacting to the past, because I remember when I was at University of Denver before coming here that they had someone from Reacting to the Past come. At least I think that's what it is, and it's like a website, right?
They
and
have a
that
website, yeah.
university professors actually can contribute to
Mhm.
and come up with these different role-playing exercises
Right.
using different evidence and
There's
stuff.
there's
I
probably a
wanted you to
series of like
explain
30 of them or something in various stages of development.
that. Okay, and have you participated in that yourself, or can you just draw upon that as a resource? Or I wasn't quite sure how that part worked.
Right, absolutely. So the two that I use, the Athens Game, The Threshold of Democracy, is one of the first books that they published. So this is a book. Students go. I order it for the bookstore. It's published by Norton right now. They just switched publishers. The Rome game, in contrast, is not published yet. So they have various stages of development, and the Rome game is close to being published, but isn't published yet. So in that case, I'm able to download the stuff off of the website. It's password protected so that the students can't get at all of the behind the scenes things. But yeah, so it's actually completely free to the students. And even the Threshold of Democracy, it's not an expensive book. I want to say it was in the range of like $18 to $20. And then you download the instructor's manual off of the website that helps you manage it. And I should say, this is not necessarily an easier way to teach. It isn't, I mean, there's a lot of grading and there's a lot of management that goes on behind the scenes, and all of the help that I get off of the website is absolutely imperative. But yeah, I think there are 6 or 8 that are fully published, and somewhere between like 30 or 40 that are in various stages of being finished.
Question for you. You mentioned maritime history. I was wondering whether you also encourage students to study industrial history or firm history or business history. Is that common in the history department?
Of course, I would like to encourage students to look more on history of technology, and we are trying it on, we are integrating the subject into a variety of our offerings. But if you're really thinking about, you would end up in a very similar situation as with maritime history. So if you really want to talk about history of technology and industrial history beyond the, let's say, social dynamics, political dimensions, if you really want to embark onto what historians used to name an inner history of technology, then you need to have this transdisciplinary knowledge into the field of engineering. And I think none of us in the department is really able to offer this. So when we are incorporating this, it's mainly about the political, economical, societal dimensions, but not about the inner workings of history of technology.
Do we have any more questions, more comments?
I just have one quick, oh, go ahead.
Maybe just one disruptive comment. And I'm actually taking off from something that Robert said. History, in some ways, is not about the past. History is essentially about how we in the present interpret the past. And if that is so, then it is more about us than about the people in the past. And this is true not just about historians who write and interpret history, but about our students who come to class to try to understand the past. And that is the essential problem that historians face, which is slightly different from what scientists face, because in a sense, if you are in, shall we say, physics, we are looking at the behavior of phenomenon, and we don't really worry about whether it was different at different times. And this is, I believe, one of the complexities of history as part of the humanities, and it is probably also what makes the teaching of history face some problems which may not be in some of the other disciplines. Any comments on that?
Well, I'm thinking of Ernest Brysock's, who's written a lot on historiography and philosophy of history. He said that history is not about the past, it's about time, which is really what you're saying. In other words, it's about the past, the present, and the future, and how the past is in the future and in the present. How we think about the future affects how we think about the past, and so on. They're very, very complexly interconnected. And so in a sense, you're right. I mean, there's a certain point at which when we study the past and write about the past, we're really writing about ourselves, right? And what's left over from the past and how we see it in today's world. In that connection, I'm still thinking about Steve's question, and I think I'd like to introduce a very useful concept here in terms of distinguishing different events and comparing them. That is, in the same sense, the word worldview. I think you can make a lot of headway here by talking about different worldviews in terms of analogies and comparisons. And that, you know, when you rest in the Salem witch trials and say the McCarthyism in the 50s, I mean, they're very superficially comparable, but boy, once you get into like you talked about religion, right, and Satan and all this, I mean, 17th century Salem, what's the worldview? What are people thinking? What's the mentality of that time? How important is religion in people's daily lives? It's phenomenally important. The 1950s is highly secularized. We have a different sort of way of thinking about Satan, right? Still there, but different. So different worldview. So I think that would sort of explode some of these easy analogies.
But the challenge for the student then, right, is to make them understand that worldview, but then not insert themselves into it. Because I then have students say, well, I wouldn't do that.
Right, exactly.
I don't understand why slavery happened, right? I wouldn't do that. And then, so to get them to view it, as you say, these exercises in sort of objective analysis of the past is the next step.
Right.
Get them into it by having them role act it, right? But then get them to step back and say, don't insert yourself and your feelings and your reactions into this.
Right.
That's the difficulty
I like how we've moved so easily from such sophisticated questions relating to worldviews and then connect them to very practical matters of instruction. So this is what we do every day, and that's why half of you are already leaving, trying to get out to your one-to-one classes. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to the Office of Academic Affairs.